This is me. And this is me when I was in year 5, aged about 10. My maiden name was Davies. Davies is a Welsh name. Wales is part of the United Kingdom. My family came from the Rhondda Valley in Wales. Many of them were involved with the coal mining industry. This is my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Edward Tyrer. He was the first in my family to start coal mining. He moved to the Rhondda Valley to Tylerstown, where it was much more prosperous to mine. Tylerstown was a typical mining village in the late 1800s. It sprung up around the pit, but housing conditions were poor and cramped. It wasn't until 30 years later that the high street began to have things like banks, grocers' shops, and even a fish and chip shop that was owned by my family. This is my great-great-grandfather David, my great-great-grandmother Anne, and the baby on her knee is my great-grandmother Jane. I'm going to leave my great-great-grandfather to tell you about mining in the Rhondda Valley.
I lived and worked as a miner in Tylerstown all my married life. It was a dangerous and dirty job. There were often explosions or landslips, and the coal dust was very bad for the lungs. My daughter, Jane, will go on to marry Thomas Davis, Mrs. Kemp's great-grandfather, but sadly, he will die aged just 30, from miner's lung. My 5 sons came to work in number 9 pit with me. When they started, they were just 13 years old. It was common for children to start working in the mines at this age, like young John Davis, shown here, aged 12. This is number 9 pit, in Tylerstown. The metal structure is called the head frame. It sits atop the mine shaft with the winding pulleys or sheaves mounted on it. 1914 saw the start of World War I. Welsh coal became extremely important to the war effort, powering industry, the railways and ships. 191,170 Welsh miners left the mines for the front line in Europe. After years of struggling to provide enough employment for all the workers, there was suddenly a shortage of labor in the mines. Miners were made exempt from military service because their jobs were considered vital, but after the Battle of the Somme, the government decided to conscript 20,000 Valley men from Rhondda's mining workforce. Here are my sons, Jacob and Di, Mrs. Kemp's great-uncles, before they went off to war. I was very lucky to have all 5 of my sons return home after the war. Here I am with 4 of them, shortly after the war ended. After the war, only my youngest son, Dan, continued to work in the mines. This is Dan, my youngest son. He went back to work in number 1 pit, in Tylerstown, when the war ended. He stayed in Tylerstown until the early 1930s but moved to Windsor in 1934. Mining had become scarce after World War I, the general strike in 1926 and the Depression during the 30s. Many people moved away from the mining villages to find other employment. Coal mining was a very dirty job. At the end of a hard-working day, we'd come home, our faces black with coal dust. There were no showers at the mine in those days. You couldn't get cleaned up before you went home. When we got back to the cottage, we'd fill up a big, old, tin tub in the kitchen, before stripping naked and scrubbing ourselves raw. The first one home got the clean water, everyone after got the dirty stuff. You could never completely get rid of the coal dust, it became ingrained in your skin. Remember my son, Jacob? Well, here he is again with his 3 children. When he went off to fight in the Great War, his wife, Bessie, and the 3 children moved in, with myself and Dan. Bessie couldn't take to our ways of living, in the coal mining villages. She complained to Jacob about us men stripping off, to have a bath in the kitchen, when we got home. Well, she was young, and it upset her to see the men naked. Jacob told her, "You just have to get used to it. This is the way we live, in the valley." But Bessie couldn't get used to it, so she left Jacob and the 3 children, she ran away. Here I am again, with my wife, Anne. We're much older now, but we still live in the same house, in Tylerstown. Our family live very nearby. Two of my daughters, Martha and Mary, and their families, live in the house opposite us. Our eldest daughter's first husband and the children continue to live with us. We are lucky, we get to see most of our grandchildren. One of our sons, Ed, emigrated to America in 1912. My wife, Anne, always loved reading. When she was 70 years old, she finally found the time. Her favorite book was Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Oh, how she wept when the character, Little Eva, died. Anne also loved Welsh poetry, by the likes of Dylan Thomas, and Welsh hymns. Anne was highly intelligent, and as a young girl, she was determined to learn to read. To pay for her schooling and lessons, Anne worked in the colliery. She would push heavy coal drams, trucks, full of coal, from the coal face. It was a dangerous job, and sometimes, children were crushed by the heavy drams. Anne earned 5 pence a day, doing this job, so she could learn her ABC. My wife, Anne, Mrs. Kemp's great-grandmother, was a gentle, loving lady, who never raised her voice. Local women, in need of advice, would go to her, knowing their problem would be shared, and that they would receive help. There were no such things as counselors in those days, and Anne was all they had. It was a hard life for the women too. There was never much money, and it was difficult to provide healthy, nourishing meals for the men who went to work underground. This is me with some of my family. Families and communities in the Rhondda's mining villages were close. However, after the 1926 strike, there was much unemployment in the mines. Times were tough and there was little income. Things were bleak during the Depression in the 1930s and many families moved away to Slough and Birmingham. We stayed in Tylerstown. Sadly, it was only when preparations for World War II began that the Valley men gained employment again. A large munitions factory was built in Bridgend, so many people who used to work in the mines travelled there, each day, for work. Our second eldest child, and Mrs. Kemp's great-grandmother, Jane, shown in the middle, as an older lady, also stayed in Tylerstown after her husband died, with 9 of her 12 children. 3, including Mrs. Kemp's grandfather, moved to Kent. Jane was a very creative lady and could turn her hand to anything. If a villager needed a present for anyone, they would leave the materials with Jane and she would turn them into something wonderful. Jane's favorite hobby was crocheting. This is Jane's son, and Mrs. Kemp's grandfather, Edward. He started his working life in the Tylerstown mines, but when World War II began, he became a stoker in the Navy. As a stoker, he shoveled coal and tended to the fire in the ship's boiler. It was a hard, physical job. As a miner, he knew coal, and ended up working with it during the war. The mines in the Rhondda Valley have all closed now, and the countryside has returned to the lush, green hillsides. The scarred land has healed, and the deep fissures have closed, no longer the land that Dylan Thomas wrote poetry about. I think that if I touched the earth, it would crumble. It is so sad and beautiful, so tremulously like a dream.